That's to remind me that if you look at my Facebook, I have put the audio and the slides online. If you don't have Facebook, that's okay. I can just see me and I can email you a link to the YouTube where they are. So this week we're going to be going over the orders that Paul gave to the weak and the strong. And we're going to be looking at Romans 14 through 15. So let's go do that. Remember this slide from last week? I showed you this slide and we talked a little bit about 1 Corinthians 8. And if you'll notice, it's different this week. This week it's about Romans 14. So I actually answered this question for you on the worksheet. Worksheet number 1, question 1, what was the issue with the meat in Romans 14? And it was this one. Can we eat possible idol meat? How do we know that? So you can open to Romans 14 or tap to it if you have an iPad. Romans 14:2 says, one person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. So this is the controversy between people who say I'll eat it unless it could be tainted, and I don't eat any meat. So look at worksheet 1, question 2. Does everyone have their worksheet? I gave out worksheets last week. Here are some. Here, Caleb, I'll give you the whole. There's a couple copies there. That's worksheets 1 through 4. I'm not sure how they're organized in that pile. There's also links online. I can get you a link to download the worksheets too. So worksheet number 1, question 2 was in Romans 14, what is the nationality of these groups? What'd you guys put there? Did you get through the passage and get any clues that tell what nationality could be dealing with here?
Well, it seems to be Jews versus Gentiles, but couldn't there be Jews in the eat meat category too? That are found in prison?
Sure, could be. So what clues in the passage made you say probably Jews? Anybody dig through the passage and find any clues? They're not super obvious. You'd have to kind of dig. The first one is that if you kind of look at the whole book of Romans, the whole thing is about Jew-Gentile relationship and the commonality that Jews and Gentiles have. So over and over again, you see the phrase through the book of Romans, the Jew first and also the Greek. And that involves, if you think through the book of Romans, it involves both are sinful by nature, both depend the same on salvation. Justification by faith was for Jews and for Christians. So it kind of goes through the whole position of Christianity and looks at it from a Jewish and Gentiles perspective and says, you guys are the same. The second is that the issues are Jewish, right? So Greek religious people weren't really vegetarians, but in Judaism there were a couple kinds of vegetarianism. First, Jews in foreign lands would often be strict vegetarians. You remember anyone famous from the Old Testament who did this while he was in Babylon? Daniel, yeah.
That is right.
And Josephus writes about it in his time of Jews doing that. And then the Nazirite vow would sometimes involve vegetarianism, but not always.
But would the vegetarianism also be because they had to have a strict way why they would, not just that they were forsaking meat, but they couldn't eat meat unless it was properly
Right.
killed.
Yes, that's why the Jews would often refrain from meat in a foreign land, because they didn't have the mechanisms for a priest to do it correctly, or for non-priests to do it correctly. Yeah.
And wouldn't that be the major reason why why Jews in Gentile lands in a smaller community or may not have access would be vegetarian? They would say, I can't, because I can't verify that this was killed correctly, or there wasn't a priest or a Jewish.
Or that it wasn't involved in idolatry. That was the case for Daniel. And for Josephus, that's what most of them were. It was mostly about avoiding possible idolatry. That's why this is, I'm saying, is the question of the chapter. The third reason that we should look at it as a Jew-Gentile issue is the word in verse 14. I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean of itself, but it is unclean to him who thinks it is unclean. Unclean is a word for evil or bad that is distinctly Jewish. It means it's common. It's the same word when we say, let's have fellowship. Koinonia or koinos is about things we have in common. And this word that implies things being bad, it just means common. And that is a distinctly Jewish way to talk about morals. And then the last is that if you look at the kind of culmination of this passage, Romans 15, 7 through 9, it is about Jew-Gentile fellowship. So starting with verse 7, it says, "Therefore welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised, to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, therefore I will praise you among the Gentiles and sing your name." So the point is that the progression of Romans 14 and into 15 is for the purpose of fellowship, and the fullness of that fellowship is the fulfillment of this Jew-Gentile joining in worship of God. So it's pretty clear that in this passage, the main controversy was between Jews and Gentiles. And historically, just quick aside, historically it's neat because this body in Rome of Christians was probably mixed Jew and Gentile. Then Claudius becomes emperor in 50 AD, I think. And he expels all the Jews from Rome. So all the Jews leave. And then it's just a Gentile Christian church for about 2 years. Then Claudius dies and all the Jews come back. And all of a sudden, this church, which had just been Gentile, now is mixed Jew-Gentile again. And so they kind of had to deal with that. So today, what we're going to be looking at is what Paul told the Romans to do about their differences on this question. So it's tempting whenever we have this discussion about Romans 14 and conscience issues to start thinking, oh, okay, then this is how I'm supposed to act with my beer in front of somebody else, right? I don't want to go to today, right? Because this leads to questions about what is properly a Romans 14 issue. So consider that there's 2 levels on which we're going to study this passage. The first one is, how do we act when it comes to real Romans 14 issues? Okay? So that's how should we exercise our freedom, how should we limit our freedom when it comes to matters of conscience, things that are really Romans 14 issues. The second one is, how do we know what is a matter of conscience? How do we know what goes in this category? And that can be a very difficult question. So just to illustrate the difficulty of that question, I want to read this quote from Gordon Fee. This is the NICNT commentary in 1 Corinthians. Okay, so listen to the end of this. Unfortunately, and despite this passage, the issue, I'm supposed to click forward. Okay, you can read it now. Unfortunately, and despite this passage, the issue of personal freedom. So personal freedom is what do I actually have freedom to do and not do? In matters that are adiaphora, that is conscience matters, as well as the limitation of freedom for the sake of others, continues to haunt many sectors of the church. Usually the battle rages over what constitutes adiaphora. Conservatives on the issue simply fail to reckon how liberal Paul's own view really is. Hence, Paul is seldom heard for the sake of traditional regulations. As we go through this, we're going to kind of, I think, realize why Paul is very seldom heard. So again, today we're just asking, if something really is a Romans 14 matter of conscience, how should we act? Okay, so on to Romans 14. You should already be open to Romans 14. So look at your worksheet number 1, question 4. Can you read question 4? I don't remember what it is. Caleb, can you read? Worksheet 1, question 4.
Terms Paul uses for him.
Okay, so what did you get? Weak and strong? Yeah, that's what I was looking for, was the one who says he cannot eat meat is weak and the other is strong. The word strong is actually not used for him until chapter 15.
Could you make the argument that it would take more strength to adhere to a strict diet than otherwise? That's not how he's using it.
Yeah, eventually we're going to talk about what these words weak and strong mean.
Okay.
And for now, I really want to just define them contextually. In other words, what this passage says about them, let's just look at that. And let's not worry too much about what we think they mean coming into it. So, Romans 14, 1 through 2. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. So, on to verse 3. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So, the strong is told, do not despise. Does anyone have a KJV?
New key.
What does it say for, let not the one who eats?
It says despise in the New King James.
Oh, it does. So in King James, I think it says set at naught, which means to consider him kind of nothing, which is surprisingly common. It shouldn't be surprising because it's kind of what Paul predicts as the danger that the strong will have, is to think the weak is lesser as a Christian and a low-quality Christian. The weak is told, do not judge. Okay, so here it is. So what I want to ask is who is being spoken to in each of these statements. So first, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains. That's talking to the strong. How about let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. That's talking to the weak. Don't pass judgment. How about verse 4?
Could it be both?
Because to despise someone is to pass judgment.
there's some commonality there. But he does choose two different words.
Because of the judgment, it makes it sound like he's talking to the weak, but I could see it being both.
This, kind of the same word is used, pass judgment is the one who, like in verse 3, when it's weak, is the krino.
Right? Yep. So I see this as a continuation, sort of an underlining for Paul of what he said in the second half of 3. He's giving some understanding to the weak about why not to judge. Right? So he corrects him and he reassures him. Both.
I was gonna,
So how does he reassure him?
God's the final judge. And I think later he tells us, don't take vengeance because God is the final judge, so we don't need to worry about that either.
Yep. But here, what is his reassurance to the weak?
well, he says that they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. And what the weak should be thinking is, the only reason I'm standing is because of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Lord is able to make him stand just as easily as he's able to make me stand.
Yeah.
So
Right.
why to pass judgment on
So
him?
let's define stand. What does he mean by stand? Why does he use the word stand? It's part of the master-servant analogy.
Judgment seat of Christ? Stand before the judgment?
Yeah, we're not quite to that part of the passage yet, but this is certainly he's bringing up the idea of being a servant.
Is it that he can act in clear conscience in a way that his master is approving of? So stand means to act in clear conscience.
Maybe. The passage hasn't said much about conscience. So think really simple. We're talking about meat today. So you've got weak brothers, they're being talked to here, and they think eating this meat is a violation. And they're being told, don't judge the servant of another. It's before his own master that he stands or falls. Maybe this is too simple. What is
sin or sin? Isn't standing meaning not sinning and falling away?
Yeah, it's to keep the word. It's like just being in good standing. To stand is to do good for your master, and to fall is an instance of sin. So maybe that was kind of too easy.
Is able, that's a strong sense in that original language, more than just can, but kind of a very
Do you mean
strong.
he will be upheld for the Lord is able to make him stand? Is that the able you're talking about?
Yeah, it's like a really, like mighty.
It's actually the word strong. It's the identical word for the strong. So when it says the Lord is able to make him stand, you could write the Lord is strong to make him stand.
But the whole sense is it's not even just able, kind of just I'm able to, but kind of a really super mighty strength.
I think that's a fallacy to take dunamis and say it's dynamite. That's sometimes used, I think, wrongly. It really is just about ability. Which is, when it says God is able to make him stand, the reassurance to the weak brother is that if God is not happy with this guy's service, if he's sinning in what he's doing, God is able to put him in good service. So as far as the weak is concerned, this is saying it doesn't need to be my effort necessarily to make him be in what I think is a good position on that. God is able to do that.
And I was just making that sense that it's not even a question about, it's kind of able, but it's a powerful, more the sense of where the standing is. As a weak brother, strong brother, it's not even a question about it. He will stand strongly. The Lord will make it. That's my sense.
He will be upheld, is what it
Yeah.
says. He will. This will
Yeah.
happen.
By the skin of his teeth, that's all.
If anybody is upheld, the Lord is upholding him.
Right.
And so trust that the Lord will uphold this person. Don't think that you have to be upholding him,
Right.
because the Lord is upholding you. And the one upholding you will uphold the other.
So, worksheet 1, question 9. Should he be convinced that he is right? Are there any more worksheets?
Only given 4.
Yeah, I can print more between.
Okay?
So, what did anyone get? You're supposed to think about this in regard to the weak and then in regard to the strong. Who should he be convinced that he is right? How? Okay, so I'm going to go past it and just look at the passage because I'm not sure how we did on the worksheets. I'm not going to ask.
It's kind of like my classroom.
Verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So a couple things to note. One is that each is to be fully convinced in his own mind. So your answer to that one should be yes for the weak, yes for the strong. Because Paul specifically says here that each is to be fully persuaded in his own, or fully convinced in his own mind. And then the second thing to note is that the location of the convincing is in the mind. That it is an act of the mind. He expects both parties to think this through. Okay, so I asked on question 10, I don't know if you got that far, should he believe that his brother is wrong? I think I'm going to skip past this one for the sake of time, but I want you to look at that one and try to think about it. Should each brother look at the other? Okay, he's convinced of his own, so does that mean he should look at his brother and think that he's wrong? Okay, that'll be a question maybe we'll pick up a little bit later. Okay, so the next 6 through 9. Okay, there it is. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. While the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and of the living. So we're going to go through this again, and we're going to look at who is kind of being talked to in each verse. So verse 6, I should wait. Okay, so I'm saying this one is the weak. The one who observes the day, this is actually more the one who's being talked about. The one who observes the day, observes it in honor of the Lord. So do you get why he's the weak?
He's following Jewish law.
Yeah, he's following Jewish Sabbath, and he can't do both, right? The strong one could do either. He could observe the day or he could not observe the day, but the weak one is convinced he has to. So he's somewhat limited in his choices because of what he thinks is right and wrong. How about the next one? The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. Who's that? Strong. Any hesitation on that? Yeah, that's the strong. How about the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God? Yeah, that's weak. How about 7 through 9? Okay, both. Both. Yeah, I make this both. So one question we'll need to ask through this is, why does the weak need to obey his conscience?
Praise to the Lord.
Right? There's two possible answers. One is because his conscience says no, and even though his conscience is wrong, he needs to obey his conscience. Did that make sense? The other idea is that he obeys his conscience because his conscience is right. Do you see the difference? So right here I'm introducing you to the difference between my view of conscience in Paul and the traditional view. In the traditional view, the weak obey their strict conscience because their conscience has a view. Even though it's wrong, they have to obey their conscience. So the fact that their conscience has a position means that they have to act in accordance with it. Okay? In my view, that's not what Paul's saying here. Look at the progression of verses 5 through 9. It starts with, each has to be fully persuaded. Why? Because once that's done, each lives his own conviction as service to the Lord.
Can you say that again?
So verse 5, each is fully persuaded. And the why is because once that's done, each brother lives his conviction as service to the Lord.
How is that against the traditional view?
It's okay. So actually, let me go forward because this will illustrate it. Okay, so here's traditional view and my view. So it starts both with the Lord giving instructions to the strong. Okay, this is understanding the faith and what Christianity is. The strong then do strong actions. They eat the meat. And they do it in honor of the Lord. Okay? The weak also have weak actions like abstaining, and they do their abstaining in honor of the Lord. Okay? And that's the same in my view. So this much is the same. There's a lot the same. Okay, here's where it gets a little different. In the traditional view, the weak don't quite hear from God about what's right and wrong. I'm just telling. I don't have time to give a lot of quotes, but this is the traditional view. Their views come from maybe somewhere else. You can't really say that it comes from themselves. If you look at the section that we're in, Paul says about both, no man lives to himself. So the living out is to the Lord. Question is, does that have a basis in what the master told you to do in the first place? Okay, am I making sense?
Well, you are, because I went to a church that we sang hymns, but we never used a musical instrument because all through the New Testament, it never mentioned harps and timbrels and things.
Sure.
And so that was a little contrary to the way I had been raised. I obeyed it while I attended there. And so they thought that, and I never went there long enough, but they thought they got that right out of the Bible, that it had clearly been spoken that there are no musical instruments in the New Testament.
Yeah, and we will come back to that when we get past. Well, right now we're in 52 AD, so that hasn't become an issue quite yet.
So when you talk about did they get their message from God or not, that church got it out of the New Testament, that interpretation of the New Testament. Therefore, they felt God had spoken to them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they would. Yeah, I won't go into why how they see that as biblical, but they certainly do. So in my view, the difference is that both the weak and the strong are actually ruled by their master. Let's go forward and look at the passage again.
Can I say one quick thing?
Quick.
I like your view because when I read this, I always think of Daniel, who chose not to eat the meat and just got wine and got water and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about vegetables here, and so I'm like, so Daniel's a weak one? Because in my mind,
Sure.
does that make sense? So he was doing what God told him to do, but God isn't necessarily telling the New Testament Christians to do the same thing. But Daniel wasn't weak and making...
But
Does that make sense?
Daniel was applying a biblical principle, which is avoiding idolatry.
Right, okay.
And that biblical principle lives on now.
Right.
There's nowhere that it says to apply it differently. So I don't necessarily see, I agree, I don't see the issue as one that the weak should view themselves as uneducated on. Yeah.
Is this somewhat analogous to the idea that I have an older and younger child, right? So my older child can go out in the backyard and play completely alone, and that's fine. But then my younger child cannot, right? So they're both going to act in accordance to my will, right? The younger one won't go out in the yard when they're not allowed to because there's nobody to watch. But then if you take that same application and flip it to say in church where I might let my younger child lay on the floor and color, but the older child has to sit in the pew. And so they're both given liberties that the other isn't given.
Yeah, in the sense that they're both serving you, but by different directions.
Yeah.
It's possibly the same. I think you're looking behind the veil. In other words, you're trying to guess what Jesus is up to with giving different orders. So the analogy here is a servant, a household servant, and his master. And so you could make another analogy, which also, this is beyond the passage, but you could say, well, you could have two servants, one of whom is a chef, and one of whom shovels manure. And they get different tools, they get different clothes. One of them has orders about cleanliness that the other doesn't for his job. And the master gives each...
Sure.
Right, so the chef shouldn't go, we're supposed to be clean. What are you doing? To the guy shoveling manure. It's a different job they've been given. And so they've been given different orders within that job.
Sure.
But we're past the passage. And that's not in the passage. Other than that you can extrapolate from this master-servant relationship. But, yeah. Okay, so verses 10 to 12. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or, why do you despise your brother? Okay, so again, they're both being talked to here now. Right? Because we brought up judgment and despise. For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us will give account of himself to God. The word account is word. So to give account is to give a statement. I don't think we approach this well enough in our hearts when we look at issues like this. What this is saying is that each of us do and will sit down with Jesus and give account for things. And Paul is taking the obedience of one another and he is downgrading that. But you can't just downgrade that. You have to upgrade in your mind the way in which our lives are to be obedience to Jesus. And the thought of sitting down with him and saying, this is why I did this, this is why I did this, should be like an earthquake in our heart.
Well, I'm not looking forward to that.
It is.
Have to tell them why I sinned and give an account for all my sin again.
Yeah, it's about sin, but then it's also about the reasoning that you had for the things you thought you could do, right? Because this is all about thinking in your mind. All this persuasion, when you do something, when you say, okay, I can have that meat, because we're still in 52 AD. When you say I can have that meat, Paul is saying, think about it. You're going to give account to Jesus. Now live. Live in honor of him.
It's not just for rewards in heaven. There is going to be.
Yeah. So, well, I don't know. The merit and... it'll be a good interview. It'll be a good interview.
But it'll be more like a punishment. And
No, I don't think so.
Well, if there's no condemnation, then it can't be that.
my heart's
Something
beating
else.
faster thinking about that.
It is hard. It's hard to, yeah. Okay, so let's go back to this, to this set of slides and this look. And what I want you to look at is that there's three aspects to the master-servant relationship. There is the master giving orders to the servant. There's the servant carrying them out as service to his master. And then the third is the account. That he at the end of the day, he says, this is what I did, and the master says, good job. Okay? So look now at the weak. Okay? So pretend that you're this guy, the weak. You think eating the meat is sinful. And you're looking at your strong brother chowing down on meat. And what are you thinking?
How could I do such an awful thing?
Right, how can he do that?
You think he's weak?
Or falling. Yeah.
He might even be looking at it and saying, I can't handle this, and I can't believe he's doing it right in front of me. He knows I can't handle this.
Right, but at this point in the passage, we're not there. We're just at that he looks at him and he judges. And he says, that's wrong. And that's what Paul is getting at. So what Paul tells him is you shouldn't judge. Verse 3. And then verse 4, he says why you shouldn't judge. Why? Because the strong has a master. Here, okay, so he says, look at this. The strong has a master. It's not you, it's Jesus. He's the servant of another. That means another besides you. Not that you don't both have the same master, but he's not your servant, he's Jesus' servant. So Paul is telling the weak, remember, he has this relationship with Jesus. Jesus is his master. It's before his master that he stands or falls, and the Lord is able to make him stand. Okay, so let's test whether you understand what I'm talking about. Paul tells the weak that the Lord is able to make him stand. What does that mean? How does the Lord make him stand? We've asked this already this morning.
Helps him be convinced fully in his own mind.
He helps him to do well. He helps him not to fall.
Right.
His spirit,
I just think it's very interesting that in the passage, it is the weak given this reassurance about the strong. The weak is the one concerned for his brother and his brother's standing. The weak is the one saying, I'm really worried that you're sinning here. I'm inclined to judge this as sin. Right? Luke 17 says that if your brother's in sin, rebuke him. Should we ignore that?
Well, what's interesting is man is looking at the action, right? We're looking at, are you eating something, are you not eating something?
Right.
But I hear you kind of saying, if I'm understanding correctly, Paul is instructing them that God knows if you are sinning intentionally or if you are acting rightly in accordance with what he's given you to do. So where we're looking at action, people are looking at action, God is looking at the mind and the heart. Are you saying some of that?
More than just looking at, though, right? That God is influencing the mind and the heart.
Right, but
Right.
we want to either judge or despise the action. Man wants to judge or despise, and Paul, I hear, is guarding against that.
Well, the essence of both judging and despising is denying the relationship at the top. Right? So the strong will look at the weak and say, you're doing this, but it's not because Jesus said. You're just a dork. Whereas the weak will look at the strong and say, you can do all that? I don't think Jesus told you you can do that.
And both
And-
fall into a question when they're getting their instruction.
We're out of time, but more slides. Okay, so next week we'll have to pick up the second half, which is what Arlen was bringing up, which is about 13 through 22. Okay. There's only one other thing I really wanted to point to in this, and that is one of these verses says that Jesus lived and died so that he might be Lord of the dead and the living. And we talked about sanctification a few weeks ago. And we said in sanctification that in death we will be glorified, we will be finally perfectly sanctified, and Jesus bought that. What this is saying, I think, the reason Paul is bringing up dead and living is because it's not just there that we can be sanctified, but even while we're living, Jesus died and lived again in order that he might be Lord of the living. So even now, he has bought the right to lord you. This is actually the one time in the New Testament that Lord is a verb. Other than the phrase Lord of Lords. That's like Lord, Lorder, so one of them is a verb. But this is the only time Lord is used as a verb. So what the picture here is Jesus is ruling you. So right in the middle of this, and this is why I say the top part of this has to be the master giving orders to the servants, is that Jesus bought with his death and resurrection the right to rule each of us. And that's central to this. It's not just give account, it's the idea of these issues of conscience coming to us from Jesus.
Well, the irony just being that we kind of want to rule one another. Jesus
Yep.
has that.
Yep.
We want to rule one another.
All right, we'll pick up on 13 through the end of the chapter next week. I won't be here next week. It'll be Mike Tully, so he'll finish this slide. We're going to go past 5 weeks. I'll have to talk to Dan about that. But this week we got about half of this week done, and then 2 weeks from now, I've got about 40 slides on 1 Corinthians. So, all right, let's pray and close.